Good afternoon. Excuse me, good morning. Thank you for joining the first panel, which is on the topic of the future of the Transatlantic Security Alliance. Before I introduce our moderator, there are a few housekeeping notes. This is a public event and it will be recorded. Please keep your microphone muted. The speakers will give opening remarks and Professor John Ikenberry will moderate the discussion. Throughout the session, please message your questions to Professor Ikenberry or in the public discussion chat box, and he will incorporate them into the discussion. Before I pass the microphone, well, the virtual microphone to Professor Ikenberry, who will introduce the speakers, let me briefly introduce him to you. Professor Ikenberry is the Albert G. Milbank Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University in the Department of Politics and the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. He is also co-director of Princeton Center for International Security Studies, which is us. Professor Ikenberry held and still holds many other prestigious positions in various academic institutions. Professor Ikenberry is the author of 8 books, most recently, A World Safe for Democracy, Liberal Institutionalism, and the Crises of Global Order, which was published last year by Yale University Press. And Liberal Leviathan, The Origin, Crisis, and Transformation of the American System in 2011 by Princeton University Press. Of course, every IR PhD student would have read After Victory, Institutions, Strategic Restraint, and the Rebuilding of Order After Major Wars, which won the 2002 Shorter Jervis Award presented by the American Political Science Association for the best book in international history and politics. In a recent survey of international relations scholars, Professor Ikenberry was ranked 10th in scholars who have produced the best work in the field of IR in the past 20 years, and ranked 8th in scholars who have produced the most interesting work in the past 5 years. It's a great honor to have him as the moderator in this session. Now the stage is yours, Professor.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you, Bailey. Both of you have been fantastic in putting together a conference with such sweep and with such a great cast of experts. And so thank you very much. It's great to work alongside Aaron Friedberg as co-directors of the center and to be part of this really student-driven annual conference. So thank you very much. Welcome everyone. This is panel 1 of a rich day of panel discussions following Ambassador McFaul's terrific tour de force of the current landscape of Russian relations with the outside world, U.S.-Russian relations in great historical and contemporary context. This panel will turn our attention to the future of the Transatlantic Security Alliance, focusing on challenges of common defense, visions of transatlantic security cooperation, the role of Europe more generally in security affairs. And we have 4 panelists who will lead us forward in this discussion. Each will have 5 or 6 minutes to speak, and then we will open it up. I will try to master the technology of monitoring the chat function, so you should be delivering your question or comment so that we can turn it back to our experts in due course. Our first speaker, Professor Mai'a Davis-Cross, is the Edward Brooke Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at Northeastern University. She has her PhD from Princeton University, and she has written widely on issues relating to Europe, European security, and Europe itself, and transatlantic security order, including in 2017, the book, The Politics of Crisis in Europe, and a more recent forthcoming book, European-Russian Power Relations in a Turbulent Time. So she will be our first speaker. I'll just go ahead and introduce all of our speakers, and then we will let them speak in sequence. Secondly, we will hear from Ms. Rachel Ellehuus, who is the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow of Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program at the Center for Strategic and International Affairs in Washington, D.C. She has previously served at the Pentagon as Principal Director for European and NATO Policy in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and she has broad expertise in NATO, regional security, and transatlantic relations. Thirdly, we will hear from Ms. Anna Wieslander, who is Director of the Northern Europe program of the Atlantic Council. She is coming to us, I think, from Stockholm. She is the chair of the Institute for Security and Development Policy, which is a Stockholm-based institute. She has many distinctions and awards and posts, and has written widely and spoken widely on European and international affairs. So we're just really glad to have her with us as well. And then finally, we have Ambassador McFaul, who has graciously agreed to come back to speak on this panel. He will be the fourth speaker, and we'll let him kind of pick and choose what he wants to do, in part reacting to our first three speakers. So that's the sequence. We have an hour, and so I'm going to turn things over to Professor Cross for her presentation, and then we'll just take it from there.
Thank you very much. It's really great to be here. Thanks for inviting me. It's particularly nice to have Professor Ikenberry moderating, as he was on my PhD committee. So this is coming full circle, and it's just delightful to participate. I want to start by just kind of pointing out that I think there is really quite a lively debate on the future of the transatlantic security these various fluctuations over time. So while I do think that the transatlantic security relationship is really sustained and is holding, it is also evolving over time. It's not just kind of staying exactly the same. And one thing I really want to point out in terms of how it's evolving or changing right now is in terms of the EU's role in the transatlantic relationship. So specifically, I think the EU is ramping up its security role. And the goal is to be primarily a stronger partner to the US, but also to achieve strategic autonomy, which does actually mean strategic autonomy from the US, to be sure that's part of it. This, however, it's not entirely new. It's been a process that's been ongoing since at least 1998, when the EU started its European security and defense policy, which became operational in 2003. But I think what we can observe now is that this momentum towards defense union has sped up, in part because of the Trump administration. And so there are a few things to mention in this regard. There's structural integration in defense, and this is known as the Permanent Structured Cooperation, or PESCO by the acronym. But this is really encompassing, it's pretty new, but it's encompassing a wide range of various projects that mean that the EU is sort of structurally integrating in terms of its actual military technology and capability. Another big one is the European Defense Fund, which is also very groundbreaking. Some would say it's the biggest new step forward in defense integration since the late 90s. And this is mainly because it's the first time ever the EU has included a budget line for defense in its common budget. Before, it used to be sort of reliant on member states' voluntary contributions. But now, with this actual defense fund. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's smaller than it was initially planned for. It's now at 8 billion euros, but it was 13 billion for the next framework plan. But nonetheless, even symbolically, it's really important because it means that EU member states are willing to actually integrate in the development of weapons, to deploy weapons or militaries together and streamline their systems. There's even talk now, and this would really help defense union in a way, of deciding some aspects of EU foreign policy by qualified majority voting instead of unanimity. So this is being discussed, and it would be a major step forward. So it seems that there is this kind of increased pace towards strategic autonomy. I do think it raises a couple of key questions. One is, can the EU actually achieve defense union? There are a lot of skeptics about the EU's ability to kind of follow through with this. And secondly, is strategic autonomy incompatible with NATO? So to answer the first, can the EU actually achieve a defense union? I would say yes. It is obviously a big step for the European integration project, but the EU has been preparing for this for some time. And Brexit actually, in some ways, cleared some of the obstacles out of the way. The UK was more resistant to defense union. And then alongside that, Russian aggression and the US provide an impetus, the US being sort of mercurial lately, provide an impetus to move towards defense union. In addition, I think the EU is not as toothless militarily as many people assume. It actually does have the wherewithal, I would say, to stand up to Russia, even if it came to some kind of military scenario. I could say more about this, but last year, Barry Posen published an article really outlining this in detail. And if you think about it, really, Germany and France alone spend more on defense than Russia. So it's not exactly that sort of toothless, as I said. In terms of strategic autonomy and compatibility with NATO, I would say just briefly, the US has strategic autonomy and it is in NATO. So that shouldn't be a problem for Europe as well. And then if we look at sort of the more non-military side of things, I think the EU really stands out in terms of thinking about cyber attacks, terrorism, disinformation, and AI. The EU is quite strong in that area. So just to wrap up, I think, there are obviously challenges. The Trump nightmare is over for Europeans. And so there's this challenge that the EU may revert to its previous stance of kind of being a little lazier in some respects in terms of moving towards strategic autonomy. So it can't do that. A second challenge is just to figure out exactly what the future division of labor with NATO will look like if the EU has strategic autonomy. And then finally, I think, the major threats are, of course, Russia and China. And the most important way to combat this is to really uphold the transatlantic relationship in the end. So I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's terrific. Ms. Ellehuus, you're next. Welcome.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Mai'a, for that great introduction, excuse me, which I'll just pick up on. I mean, I think you made some good points about the increasing relevance of the EU, and that was actually what I was going to open with, which is when we think about the Transatlantic Security Alliance, and I like how you've dubbed it very broadly to be sort of institutionally agnostic, the world does look very different than when NATO was founded, or even when the European Union was founded. So I think the challenge now is for the individual actors, whether it's the EU and NATO or the individual member states, to adapt to that new reality. And I sort of see four areas. The first is that the nature of the threats has changed. So, at the inception of both NATO and the EU, they were very focused on the North Atlantic area. They were very focused on threats in that space, and those threats were primarily military and state-based. Now we're seeing a world that is much more independent. The threats are much more global. They're going across different national boundaries. Just look no further than the current health crisis, but also things like climate and migration. I mentioned that these threats are not always state-based. In the past, it was pretty clear when there was an incursion along NATO's borders or some sort of threat to EU sovereignty. But now we're seeing things that are happening below the threshold of military conflict, things like economic coercion, or as you mentioned, Mai'a, disinformation. That's a lot harder for an organization like NATO that is based on military capabilities to respond to, because attribution is a problem. They need the indications and warnings to say it was definitely Russia in this period of time. And because there will be denial of having done that attack, I think it becomes even more challenging for the alliance. I think NATO is also challenged by the ability to operate in these new domains. It has evolved, particularly in cyber and space. Last year, the alliance said that cyber was, a fourth domain right alongside the other conventional ones, and it even went so far as to say that a cyber attack would constitute an Article 5 attack and warrant a response. We're not quite there in space yet, but the alliance is really working hard to protect the safety of its citizens, even in these less traditional domains where it has less experience. The second change that individual allies and international organizations are responding to is more competition. We talked about rising power, strategic competitors. The West, so to say, no longer has the monopoly on the values model. If you look at, for example, the greater Mediterranean region, you see Chinese investments there, you see them in Africa, you see them in Latin America. These are investments that come without conditionality on human rights, they come without strings attached. And so for many countries, this is another way to achieve their objectives without that conditionality and that baggage. So that is another form of competition that NATO and the EU are dealing with. We see that now, for example, with the challenges of managing solutions for communications infrastructure and networks like 5G. How do you make the case to individual countries that Huawei presents a security concern when there aren't necessarily viable European alternatives? Is that something we're willing to put our weight behind in order to push back against those security concerns? The third dynamic would be sort of shifting power dynamics. And Mai'a, you alluded to this. We now have a stable, wealthy, more independent Europe that does want more independence of action. And this, I think it's important to point out that this term strategic autonomy, while it started out, primarily being France mentioning this desire for strategic autonomy in the military space, that has now sort of expanded horizontally and has also been applied, for example, to strategic autonomy in terms of imposing sanctions. We saw that with the JCPOA and efforts to sort of circumvent the sanctions on Iran. And so I think that is something that we're going to have to counter, a more independent EU. And in the digital space as well, may I add, strategic autonomy has been applied there as well. At the same time, we're seeing the US turn a bit inward. We have a much more domestic focus on repairing divisions, investing in our infrastructure and creating jobs. Fourth dynamic that's affecting the alliance is, the value of what we stand for is not necessarily obvious. The publics and younger generations don't have that same connection or affinity for NATO or even the European Union that they did in the past. They're much more global citizens with more global outlooks. And so things like nationalism or isolationism are an attractive narrative sometimes against this idea of globalization and collective security interests. Overall, though, I think, according to the three models that Mai'a laid out, I tend to be on the more optimistic side as well. I think the new administration offers more predictability from the United States. You've seen an early concerted effort for more coordination with the European Union, the Quad, the P3. You've seen very concerted efforts to align our policies on Russia, Turkey, China. We're doing a number of policy reviews where we're working very closely with European counterparts to come up with at least aligned policies, if not identical policies. And I think it is positive that we see this willingness to let Europeans lead. I think with European defense, we too often have heard rhetoric from both sides of the aisle that make it sound like a zero-sum game. But if you look at Secretary Blinken's remarks of late, you can see he says things like, when allies pull their fair share of the burden, they deserve a fair share in the decision making, or that we will treat EU efforts to increase their defense as an asset, not a threat. So I think there is a very strong prospect there for leveraging the EU's comparative advantages in things like diplomacy, economic strength, and those types of tools that aren't necessarily the purview of NATO or even the United States. Because the challenge could be, and here's where I'll sort of round things out, is if NATO tries to stretch itself too broadly and become something that it's not, right? Because at the end of the day, it is a military alliance, albeit with political consultation mechanisms to sort of talk through problems and challenges and opportunities. It's going to forget its primary purpose. The Secretary General, during the current crisis, people asked him, well, what's NATO's role in the pandemic? And he said, well, NATO's role in the pandemic is to prevent the health crisis from becoming a security crisis. So I offer that just because it indicates that while NATO and the Transatlantic Alliance per se have a role to play in a lot of these newer areas, sometimes they'll be in more of a supporting role rather than a lead role. And it will be through these types of partnerships with the EU and the United Nations and even private sector actors that they leverage those strengths to supplement their own.
Thank you so much. That's terrific. Ms. Weislander, you're next.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Rachel and Mai'a for those really great introductions and remarks. And I will continue. I thought I'm situated in Stockholm, and I would like to give you just an idea of which indications that I look at in assessing the security situation here from a Northern European perspective. And there's so much going on. I just give you a brief overview of this past week. What we have there in the Arctic, a big Russian exercise, UNCA-21, where 3 Russian nuclear power submarines surfaced from under the ice up into an area of 300 meters for the first time in history. It has not been done before. And this is even, as Putin said, nor in the history of modern times. So each of those submarines can carry up to 16 ballistic missiles each. That was one power projection. Then on Monday, we had over the North Atlantic, over the North Sea, over the Baltic Sea, and over the Black Sea, within 6 hours, NATO fighter jets scrambled 10 times to shadow 6 various groupings of Russian bombers and jet fighters. And this is the whole Russian arc from the north down to the south to the Black Sea. 6 hours, also very unusual. Then on Tuesday in Kyiv, in Ukraine, the parliament there warned and declared an escalation in the east, a warning of Russia amassing troops on its borders. So that's what we're watching now. Pro-Moscow separatists violating the ceasefire, and there is new equipment drawn into Ukraine, causing the US Military European Command to raise its watch levels this week to potential imminent crisis. We had yesterday in the North Atlantic Council a special meeting on the situation in Ukraine and what this means. We had Russia warning of Ukraine taking proactive action, as they called it, and what would be the Russian response to that. Now, meanwhile, in Russia, we have Alexei Navalny, poisoned by Russia, then put into prison when he came back from hospital care in Germany, starting a hunger strike in protest of being tortured, woken up 8 times every night, and then denied sleep and denied medical help. We have in Belarus last weekend demonstrations starting again with hundreds detained for protesting against fraud election by Lukashenko, the dictator, in August last year, and lack of democracy in Belarus. Today is day 237 of the public uprising in Belarus. Meanwhile, we had Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov traveling to China and stating there that there were no more relations between his country and the EU, blaming Brussels for destroying mechanisms built over the years. And we had also Russia Deputy Defense Minister Alexander Fomin going to Myanmar, to Burma, to strengthen the military ties and receive a Medal of Honor, while the military regime shot hundreds of civilians, including children, civilian protesters on the streets. So just recently, the National Defense Radio Establishment, the Swedish National Authority for Signals Intelligence, wrote in its annual report that the military operations in Sweden's immediate area are established at a level reminiscent of the Cold War. Attacks on research environments, a prominent terrorist threat, and military level in the immediate area by state actors with very powerful tools. So this is what we wake up to here in Northern Europe. And it has been like this for the past 7 years. And I think that Professor McFaul, when he said that power matters and the rise of Russia is real, yes, it is. This is what we are dealing with. So when it comes to the European Union and some challenges there on the security coordination, I think that this is one major area for several countries in the EU, that there are divergent views on this threat perception, as we heard from previous speakers too. Not everybody shares this, what we feel so closely with the proximity to Russia. But on the other hand, we are completely dependent on external support by others, firsthand the United States, in order to handle such an adversary. Neither France nor the UK is not even part of the EU anymore. Germany just started to build up its defense posture, and there is no such preparations at all. There is also, as has been mentioned, then the divergent degrees of autonomy or / independence is a huge discussion, as the other speakers said, for the EU to be a global actor. Independence from China, but also independence from the US. And here we are quite worried when it comes to defense and security, because the EU is not fit at all to handle these crises. And I don't agree, I have not read this the Barry Posen piece, but I would not agree that the EU is nothing to hold hand if there would be even a regional conflict in Europe. We would not be able to handle that without the United States. So what we would like to see, or what I would like to see, when I agree that there is this clear tendency of the EU to discuss more of a defense identity. The initiatives that Mai'a talked about are there, of course. But what we need to do much more is to integrate this within the NATO framework and have much more of a European pillar. And for that, I think we need much more of a new kind of leadership across the Atlantic, where we have, as the new Biden administration has hinted at, also responsibility sharing, but much more serious discussions on who does what, where, and with capabilities. How do we develop capabilities that are able to be used within both frameworks? And how do we also know who takes the lead, not only military with capabilities, but diplomatically starting with a conflict? That's also a big issue to my mind. So I think we need much more here of an agreement with the US on the degree of independence that Europe has to do. This is not only a discussion for Europe, for the US to watch, and that might be my last remark here. I think it's very important that we do this together, because there can be no European autonomy, which is credible within security and defense, if it's not agreed upon with the US. And that's where we need to head in unity. That would be my recommendation. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. Professor McFaul, we turn to you to offer any further reflections. You've heard three statements on Europe, each with a little bit of a focus on the future new threats and on the question of European autonomy. Can you give your thoughts on what you've heard and sort of weave it into your larger narrative about the changing character of Russian foreign policy and threats on the East?
Well, sure. Thanks for having me. Great set of presentations. And I've spoken already for a long time, so I'm going to be very short and really ask two sets of questions. And what I'm particularly interested in is the European neighbor policy, the neighborhood, the ENP, the countries on the borders, both in Belarus, Ukraine, and the Caucasus, but also in Northern Africa. And it's kind of two sets of questions to everyone. I deal with, literally in the last 10 days, I've talked to Belarusians, Ukrainians, Georgians, Russians, and one group on Armenia, now that I think about it. And the sense that people have there, in those that are involved in the government in Georgia and Ukraine, they feel like nobody's paying attention to their struggles. And they talk about both the Biden administration and Brussels. And I'm wondering if you think that's fair or not. And if is that just a sign that these are just difficult issues and they're always going to be hard? Or if this is a transitional moment because the Biden team hasn't powered up. They don't have any of their people there. Obviously, they're incredibly thin when it comes to Europe right now, but that's because people are still going through the confirmation process. Or an alternative is, no, the Biden team actually thinks that they are experts on Europe. They've got this. Everybody's so happy that Biden's there and Trump is not. And therefore, they're focusing on what they think is the strategic challenge that they're not as well equipped to deal with, which is China. And I'm just interested how it looks from your various different perspectives on that. I used to work, with the Biden team. I know them well. I've traveled with the vice president to Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, and Russia. And Tony Blinken was on that trip, obviously. And there's nobody that knows the ENP better than President Biden. We've never had a president that's known more about Ukraine and Georgia than him. But could there be a paradox to that, which is they think they know it so well that they don't have to focus on it? I can tell you there's a lot of anxiety in that region. So how to think about that? And in particular with strategic autonomy, those countries, and here the Belarusians and Russians I want to add to the conversation, they want to know, well, what does that mean for them? When you think of European autonomy, are you thinking that Belarus is a part of that or not? Because they feel like there's being lines drawn in ways that they feel very uncomfortable about. And I would just be clear, like, obviously what to do in Belarus, what to do in Georgia and Ukraine, let alone Russia, are really hard. Don't get me wrong. There's no silver bullet here. But are they right to be nervous, or is this more of a transitional thing? And then related to it is just, the wider region. When the European neighborhood policy was talked about a lot, it was talked about for Northern Africa. And, what does strategic autonomy mean for a place like Libya or Syria? And what does it mean in terms of European views towards that part of the world versus American views? As you see, to me, a pretty strong shift away from thinking about the Middle East. What happens to that part of the neighborhood in this new moment?
Terrific. Thank you very much. Why don't we circle back to our first three speakers with those questions in mind? And I think that's a good way to start. And I'll just invite our participants, if you have a question, write it up in the chat function and I'll monitor it. Mai'a, do you want to start?
Sure. Yes. Thank you very much. Those are really excellent and wide-ranging questions. I think for the European neighborhood policy and thinking about the southern and eastern areas around the EU, it is important for the EU to include these regions and countries within these plans for strategic autonomy. It's obviously not the same as being an EU member state, but the EU's had a long history of including non-EU countries in common security and defense policy projects, like Norway and Turkey, for example. So I think there can be invitations, for example, to participate not only in the common security defense policy, but also in the permanent structured cooperation, or PESCO, that I mentioned before. In addition, though, where the EU has a really strong presence in general in the world is the development aid part of all of this. So I think it really needs to kind of take a multi-pronged approach and continue heavily with development initiatives in the neighborhood. And as far as looking at the transatlantic relationship and where the United States' attention should be, and this sort of conundrum over to whether to focus more on Russia or China and how the EU should be involved in that, I think there are two examples that stand out in my mind as really important that show how much the transatlantic relationship needs to stand strong. One is the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project, and the other is the recent investment agreement between China and the EU. So for Nord Stream 2, as I'm sure many of you know, it's 95% complete, but it does really drive a wedge between the US and the EU, unfortunately, the last thing that needs to be done when you're thinking about Russia. So the pipeline, which in a way isn't even needed because there's already another one that could have been upgraded, it skirts around Poland and Ukraine, and it goes straight to Germany. And it's really not great as an idea. It's something German and other companies, I mean, a range of companies have interest in making money off of this, but it doesn't help with the geopolitics of the situation. And with the investment agreement, hopefully, it seems in the last few days, these tensions over Xinjiang in China have resulted in the EU really stepping back from authorizing the investment agreement at the stage of the European Parliament where it is now. But again, this is clearly designed to drive a wedge between the US and the EU, again, because just as the Trump administration was ending, very quickly, China and the EU signed this agreement that doesn't involve the US and also doesn't restrict Chinese violations of rules enough, especially labor rules. So I think focusing on this is really important. The US can't afford to just say, oh, I'm going to look at China on its own, because the route to dealing with both of these big problems is to work with the Europeans in both cases.
Thank you very much. I'm going to switch to first names here. Rachel, and then Anna.
Absolutely. Well, I'm glad, Mai'a, you mentioned both Nord Stream 2 and the EU-China investment agreement, because for me, those are two, strong examples of how hard it is, not only for the US and the EU to come up with a common position, but even within Europe, there are a lot of divisions where Europe doesn't really speak with one voice. There are a lot of EU countries, particularly the Baltic states, Poland, some of the Scandinavian and Nordic countries as well, who are very much against Nord Stream 2, and it's actually inconsistent with the EU's third energy directive. But sort of how do we compel change in that area and get countries like Germany, for whom Nord Stream 2 is in their national economic interest, to subsume that interest for the collective good. And I think that's going to be a persistent challenge going forward. But Ambassador, to your question, I don't want to speculate on sort of what's going on with the Biden administration's Europe folks at the moment, but certainly China is, they've said this before. I mean, Russia is maybe the most immediate challenge, but China is the longer term pacing threat. And so, as somebody who is Europe focused, when I think about force posture in Europe, prospects for enlargement, I think it's going to be pretty steady state for the next 4 years. I don't expect, huge new bases or anything like that in Europe. But what I do think there is space for in both the EU and NATO is trying to get around this enlargement fatigue with countries like Ukraine and Georgia and even some of the Balkan countries by rethinking what those relationships look like. So, technically, Ukraine and Georgia are enhanced opportunity partners to NATO. They have the same status as Sweden and Finland. But if you look at sort of how Sweden and Finland utilize the enhanced opportunity partnership, it's much more robust than what Georgia and Ukraine are doing. So we could have things like, more shared planning, or inviting them to sit in on some of the policy discussions in the alliance. And I think there are similar moves in the EU that could be made that are short of enlargement, because I think, unfortunately, there is a lot of fatigue there, led by some of the biggest member states.
Thank you. Anna?
Yes, thank you. Well, I think, the neighborhood, as you mentioned it, from Belarus to Caucasus, Central Asia, Northern Africa, I think that's exactly where the EU should focus on becoming more of a global actor, even though it's a global actor within its exact neighborhood. But, and I think this fits very well with the responsibility sharing with the US as well. And the EU approach should be integrated, combining foreign policy, security policy, defense measures, and aid in a comprehensive approach to really get a good grip of these countries, and combine the diplomatic means with the capabilities that are developed. I think that's very important, because that also gives credibility towards the United States, that if there is a problem, the EU can deal with that problem. And as we noticed, to the second part of your question, I think from a European view, it's very noticeable that there are other challenges for the US. China apparently, and also that the signaling is coming slower, and the means to address them are also slower. I think the Biden administration wants to signal quicker if something happens in Belarus than the Trump administration did, for instance, or Nagorno-Karabakh, or so on, that they are on top of things, but not much follows in that sense. So I think there are signals, but the follow-up is also slower, indicating that there are other concerns that they are more preoccupied with, and perhaps that's fair. I think we should draw the consequences of it, and I think it should be handable for the EU to step up there in those areas.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a question about China and its implications for transatlantic relations and NATO. And it goes back to Professor McFaul's point, I think, in his lecture, which I thought included a comment about perhaps the downside of the pivot to Asia and the Quad as the kind of centerpiece of American grand strategy. And so I guess my question to each of you is, what does this, what has to be described as a overwhelming emergence of China as the centerpiece of how the US is going to think about the world going forward, both in its defense policy, technology, its way of framing the big struggle for the world, the struggle that Biden has has framed between autocrats and Democrats. The autocratic world and the democratic world are at a crossroads. Who will win? This is all focused on China, and what are the implications for transatlantic relations and U.S. NATO relations? It seems like you can argue that it takes our eye away from these old relations. It diverts resources. It becomes taken for granted. You want to kind of keep it on the back burner, so you don't really spend as much time talking about these little flashpoint border and neighborhood issues. Or you could argue it the other way, that it actually gives NATO a new, broader vision, and indeed Europe becomes more important to the United States, not less important, because you have to have Europe for an effective response to China. So is it just both ways, and that's the bottom line, or what should we what should we worry about? I guess is the way I might phrase it in the context of the singularity, if you will, of China as American foreign policy attention. I'll let anybody who wants to.
I can say a few words on that. It's such a great question. I think that there's been a track record of sort of inadvertently empowering China by focusing so strongly on it over time and even prematurely focusing on China, both as kind of this hegemon in the making and as the best place to engage in trade. And it's kind of emboldened many Chinese diplomats, I think, as we saw in the recent diplomatic interaction between Blinken and the Chinese representatives. And that kind of war using words, narratives, and kind of fighting openly in the public sphere about which values matter, as though these Chinese authoritarian values are somehow legitimate, is really dangerous. So, I mean, obviously there has to be a focus on China because it is behaving aggressively. And the lessons of the past show that, 20 years ago when China was included in the WTO and the idea was that it would naturally just kind of open up and democratize, that assumption has been proven wrong. So that's the lesson there, that there has to be a harder approach when it comes to China, targeted pressure against human rights abuses in Hong Kong, in Xinjiang, possibly against Taiwan and so on. But if the US focuses so exclusively on China and doesn't kind of underpin it with the sort of bigger liberal world order context, then it's problematic because it continues to embolden China in these actions that harm that very liberal world order. And I think that ultimately the aim has to be to really strengthen multilateralism, to be able to respond diplomatically when you have situations like diplomatic bullying. But at the same time, to recognize that it's not a foregone conclusion that China is going to become the global superpower and take over, and the US is going to decline and the West is going to decline. That's not a foregone conclusion. I think China itself, in its increasing aggression and authoritarianism, is showing insecurity, that internally it is not a system that really can just straightforwardly be upheld, a system based on repression. Ramping that up is betraying China's weaknesses. And so, being able to reflect that in diplomatic narratives and in soft power on the part of the West is important. Otherwise, you just kind of create almost a self-fulfilling prophecy dynamic. So it's obviously a very complex issue. And I'm kind of saying that, ultimately, I think that the US and Europe should focus more on what is strong in the international system and what is desirable in the international system, the rules-based order and liberalism. And at the same time, recognize China's threat, but deal with it in a way that doesn't just leave it out of the system, but also really puts pressure in particular instances when it's important.
Thank you. Yes, Michael?
Just two comments. Great question. And it's a question I'm sure we'll be talking about for years and decades. I would just say two things. One is my own view is there should be some division of labor here. I think this idea that we have to have NATO involved in all kinds of containments and neo-containments and ships in Asia is wrong. I don't think we need to do that. I think we can achieve our objectives there without making the entire focus of NATO to China. And that tension is there. It was especially there with the Trump administration, but it lingers now. And we just heard for the last hour about some really big challenges to liberalism and security right in the neighborhood. Let's pick up some wins in Georgia and Ukraine in the short term, and that in turn will build to make us better to deal with the liberal international order and strengthen that Mai'a was talking about. That I know that not everybody agrees with me in the Biden team on that, but that's my view. Second, I do think I haven't read it yet, John. We should get you to answer, but I have your new book. It just came last week. I'd love to hear your answer to it. My second reaction listening to Mai'a is we need to reinvigorate the liberal international order, including some new things, by the way, some new configurations, and small D Democrats around the world need to find new ways to come together. And that's where we do that globally with our European partners, not in this like, let's move NATO to Asia, but think about that more systematically. And then just third, bureaucratically, and this is kind of a tiptoe answer to what I was asking my colleagues. I think it's premature, but I worked in the government for a while, and I know all the people in this current government, and the organization does matter. So if you look at the NSC, Kurt Campbell's built a giant empire over there with all kinds of people. They're all great people. And Kurt, many of us know him. John, you've known him for a long time. Very talented guy. That's good. But it's striking how little focus there is on Europe, let alone the greater part of Europe at the NSC. Likewise, everybody's waiting for Toria Nuland to be named the undersecretary, and that'll be great. But can Toria run the entire thing that we're talking about? I'm not so sure. And then the Pentagon, I don't know enough about the Pentagon. I'll let others speak about that. My colleague here, Colin Call, still waiting to be confirmed, and I'm always sheepish about. I want him to get through before I say anything more about that. But there is this bureaucratic shift. Reorganization. There's lots of papers, there's lots of reviews, and lots of people wrote their papers before they went to the government, right? We've all read them about new ideas for how to deal with China. I don't see the same bureaucratic attention, or I would say intellectual attention, for dealing with the challenges that we've been talking about. And maybe that'll be corrected over time, but that worries me, because I think we need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time.
Can I jump in?
Yes, please, Anna.
Yeah, I think for NATO and China, I think that's really interesting, because actually in December 2019, it was the first time that NATO at a summit declaration even mentioned China. So that is how new it is, so to say. And if you do interviews at NATO headquarters, they would say that, well, NATO has not gone to China. China has come to NATO. And I think that's how we experience it a lot in Europe, that China is suddenly all over the place. It's not that you have to, you can see the US interest in China, and you can fear that the great powers will divert their resources over there, the frigates and so on. But at the same time, we have China all over here. So I think it will come out naturally. NATO does not yet have a China policy, but I think it's pretty clear that you would move towards perhaps more strategic consultations and an understanding of what China is, and especially what kind of threat China poses in Europe, to be honest. What does it mean that China wants to invest in all this critical infrastructure, in the harbors, in the digital communications nets, in an airfield in Finland? How does it hang together? We don't have that assessment yet, but we need to have that. And then I think coming back to responsibility sharing, I would foresee an operational division between Europe and the US, where perhaps Europe then naturally takes on more responsibility for Europe if there is an overstretch, really, and then we have a high level of threat both from Russia and China, Asia, that would kind of really stretch the US resources. But I would expect the planning ahead to be that Europe will take on more responsibility here. You could see the UK integrated review that just came out. You have a tilt towards the Indo-Pacific, but it's pretty modest, and you still have a very strong focus on the Euro-Atlantic area. And since the UK is Europe's largest ally, that's an important signal for us.
Rachel, can I ask you a sort of pivot a little bit here? We've just got 5 or 6 more minutes. I was struck by your comment about the next generation of Europeans, the younger generation, may not have the values, identity, association with NATO and with the West as a as a confederation of liberal democracies that have been struggling to preserve their way of life, and NATO is at the heart of that goal. And my question is, could you tell us what the implications of that might be for Atlantic relations, but more specifically, or in addition, inside of the West, as Michael has mentioned, and on the border of Europe, of NATO and the EU, there are retrograde democracies, some of which are in NATO and some of which are in the EU. So how does Europe discipline its own illiberal actors inside of the fold? What is being done? What can be done? And what does that struggle inside the NATO system mean for the broader strategic orientation towards the outside world? So just a reflection on that, and anybody else who wanted to jump in, maybe somebody else wanted to speak to that
Sure.
as well, but please.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to touch on that. And with that comment in my opening remarks, you know, it's more that I think, you know, younger generations just take it for granted that, you know, they've always grown up as EU member states. They've always had sort of, you know, the ability to travel freely and study in different EU countries. And, you know, the transatlantic relationship is something you read about and sort of take for granted. So I do think the Biden administration is very smart in terms of this policy of a foreign policy for the middle class. And I think Europe should go through a similar exercise about kind of stepping back and explaining to people why an organization like NATO or the European Union makes them more secure, more prosperous, creates opportunities for them, or is in a position to deal with these global challenges that no individual nation can manage on its own. I do think that we've allowed sort of the values side to erode with more of a focus on threats, challenges, and interests. And from a NATO perspective, it is definitely starting to have consequences. And I think you're going to talk about this in some of the later sessions. But, you know, NATO has always had sort of arguably, you know, quasi-liberal democracies among its membership. You know, throughout the 60s, we had issues with repeated coups in Turkey. We had, you know, the Greeks, the Portuguese. I mean, there have always been countries who are more or less liberal or illiberal. The difference now with sort of what we're seeing with Hungary and Poland and Turkey is they are allowing these illiberal tendencies to spill over into alliance business. So to give you just sort of, I mean, the most egregious example is Turkey's purchase of the S-400, which actually undermines NATO's air defense system and its ability to actually defend Turkey, ironically enough. But there are softer examples of that as well. We had a situation maybe about a few years ago where Hungary blocked meetings of the NATO Ukraine Council because they were unhappy with a language law in Ukraine that they maintained discriminated against Hungarian minorities in Ukraine. That's fine for them to push back on that, but that is not NATO business. That is bilateral business. So I think we're seeing, you know, bilateral disputes pollute the alliance. I think the other thing that we're seeing is by not addressing these illiberal tendencies and things like cracking down on freedom of the media or disinformation, we allow our adversaries to use that against us. You know, the Russians are, in particular, very good at finding these vulnerabilities in our society and targeting their disinformation to exploit those vulnerabilities. Now, it's limited what the alliance can do. NATO operates by unanimity, so it's very difficult to punish without feeling those repercussions somewhere else. But I think just something as simple as reminding the member states what they signed up for when they, you know, signed on the dotted line with the North Atlantic Treaty, in which in the preamble, it's pretty clear what they've signed up to in terms of values. and sort of common standards and practices, and then calling out that behavior. So the same way we call out bad behavior on 2 and 20% and not pulling the weight on burden sharing, there could almost be a stock taking of that side of the democracy side as well. Clearly, the EU is more strongly positioned. They have mechanisms like Article 7. They have economic levers that, should they choose to use them, they technically could use against some of these democratic backsliders. But again, you know, we've seen it. It's really hard to get everyone to agree to hold these countries accountable. But I think it's high time that we moved in that direction.
Thank you very much. Bailey, I think I'm going to throw it back to you. This has been a terrific panel, and Michael, thank you. That book you have looks terrific. I can't wait to read it. But this is a set of issues, and a panel is successful when you end the panel and you know there's more to say and there's more to probe. So that's very much the case here. And so I hope in the subsequent panels, some of these themes can be picked up. But thank you all coming in from near and far for this terrific discussion.
Thank
Bailey?
you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes. Bye.
Well, thank you very much to everyone who participated in this panel, and we will be reconvening at 1 p.m. to talk about human security and the refugee crisis in Europe and the pandemic. So we hope to see you there, same Zoom link, and we will see you at 1 p.m. Thank you very much.
Thank you.